The Oprichniks are likely the most famous 16th century figures. In popular culture, they appear almost like demons serving Ivan the Terrible. Well, just think about it. Black riders with grim faces, senselessly cruel, bloody, and completely alien to anything human. But if you stop and ask a simple question, how exactly did they live? The familiar picture starts to fall apart. To understand this, starting with executions and horror is pointless. We'll first have to figure out why, in the Tsardom of Moscow, a situation arose where the Tsar suddenly decided that ordinary power was no longer enough for him, and why he needed people placed outside the law who became his main tool for ruling the country. Hi, I'm Semyon. This is History Shows How Did They Live segment. I declare it open, and today we have one of the darkest and most controversial episodes of the series. How did the Oprichniks of Ivan the Terrible live? Well then, let's dive into the realities of the 16th century calm music. Why were Oprichniks originally needed? To understand this, we need to forget everything we know about strong centralized power for a moment and look at the Muscovite Tsardom of the mid-16th century as it really was. Formally, the Tsar was at the head of the country, but in reality, his power was far less absolute than it might seem at first glance. Alongside him existed an entire world of noble families in the form of boyars and princes, who had their own lands, money, and connections. Most importantly, their political will. These people weren't officials in the modern sense. They didn't serve the state, but governed only when it suited their own interests. Today they supported the Tsar, but tomorrow they could sabotage his decisions, and at the most critical moment they could start negotiations with his enemies. For the feudal world, this was kind of the norm, but Ivan Grozny saw it as a problem, which over time turned into an obsession. The situation was made worse by the fact that the Tsardom lived in a state of almost constant war. In the south, there were the Crimean Tatars and the constant threat of raids in the west. The Livonian War, which quickly turned from a promising offensive into a difficult and protracted conflict with strong opponents. In such conditions, Ivan increasingly saw any defeat, any disruption of supplies, or failure of a campaign not as his own mistake or misfortune, but as the result of someone's malicious intent. And to be honest, the princes and military commanders gave him reason for suspicion. Some of them fled abroad for various reasons, be it fear, political calculation, or service to another ruler. It's a typical 16th century situation. But for the Tsar, it looked like a chain of betrayals in which he didn't see individual defectors, but a whole hostile environment. On top of all that, add Ivan's personal experience, who grew up surrounded by palace intrigues. He saw firsthand how the boyars fought for power. And he learned early on a simple idea, that there were far too many people around him who lived by their own rules and didn't consider his authority absolute. As the war dragged on, his suspicions began to undermine his trust in everyone around him, and the Tsar came to the conclusion that the old mechanisms no longer worked. Ivan Grozny was looking for ways to quickly deal with those he considered a threat, but these courts, traditions, the church, and the Boyarduma just slowed the process. That's why Ivan needed people who wouldn't ask why, wouldn't look back at family lines, and wouldn't seek compromises. People who were taken out of the usual order, subordinate only to him. At that moment, the idea of the Oprichnina became a logical but very dangerous solution. If the old system cannot be completely subordinated, then a new one must be created within the country, with its own rules, its own lands, its own troops, and its own enforcers. Oprichnina, simply put, the word itself was not new. In the old tradition, Oprich meant separately, specially outside the general order, and Oprichnina referred to an allocated share, most often a part of an inheritance. Ivan, however, used this term for governance, not property. Simply put, he sort of set aside a special, separate part of the state for himself, which lived by different rules. And yes, the people who served in this system during the time of Ivan the Terrible were not called that. They were called the Tsar's men, and the word Oprichniki would appear later as a convenient term for those who found themselves outside the usual order. Thus, in 1565 the country was practically divided into two parts. One part continued to live by the usual rules, with the Boyar Duma, courts, and traditional administration. The other part became the personal domain of the Tsar, where he was not just the supreme ruler, but the sole source of power and law. In Moscow, whole cities, districts, and streets were included in the Oprichnina. These were not ruined outskirts, but wealthy, peaceful lands that could support the new Oprichnina court. Former owners tied to the elite or suspected by the Tsar were evicted without trial or explanation. The lands and estates were directly controlled by the sovereign to support the Oprichniks. So, the Oprichnina was not only about terror, it was also a huge administrative and economic machine, and it was precisely to maintain it that the best lands were taken. The Oprichnina had everything of its own orders, its own administration, its own revenues, and its own army. Formally, it belonged to the Moscow Tsar, but in reality, it was its own state. In this state, where the usual restrictions did not apply, the people who served in it obeyed only the Tsar and no one else. Who became an Oprichnik? When the Oprichnina system was created with its own lands, money, and administration, the main question became who would actually serve in it. Ivan Grozny needed not just armed men, but those he could rely on without regard for the people, connections, or old obligations. Selection for the Oprichnina was based on personal loyalty and usefulness, not nobility. The Oprichnina mainly included minor service nobles from poor families, for whom the old system was nearly inaccessible. In daily life, their career ceiling was obvious: service, war, occasional rewards, and always the sense that noble families decided everything at the top. But the Oprichnina broke this logic. It wasn't an advantage, but raised suspicion. The fewer family ties someone had to the boyar class, the safer they appeared to the Tsar. For these people, serving in the Oprichnina was a rare and almost unbelievable social ladder. If yesterday you were just an ordinary serviceman, today you became a man of the sovereign and you didn't care about ordinary laws, any boyar courts, or who was above you. Older by birth, now your fate is directly tied only to the will of the Tsar. In a world ruled by connections and lineage, this felt almost miraculous. Of course, among the Oprichnina there were also representatives of noble families, but most often these were either junior branches or people whose position at court was unstable. For them, the Oprichnina became a way to survive and maintain influence in a time when the old rules were collapsing. It's important to understand that the Oprichniki, or more precisely, the Tsar's chosen people, were far from a homogeneous group. They included enforcers, execution participants, military administrators, palace servants, and managers. The Oprichnina court required thousands of hands and minds, and not all of those hands held a sword. But regardless of their role, all of them owed their position not to birthright, but to the Tsar's favor. Service in the Oprichnina was seen by many as a path to a better life, offering money, land, protection, and a feeling of being chosen. But along with that, it demanded absolute loyalty and a readiness to carry out orders, the limits of which were set by only one person. What did they actually do? When the Oprichnina began to operate at full strength, it quickly became clear that its main task was not governance or security in the sense we are used to. The Oprichniki were engaged in searching for treason, and they interpreted this concept quite broadly. It could be a real conspiracy, a suspicious look, a court that was too wealthy, or a careless word overheard by the wrong person at the wrong time. And it's clear that in such a system, any kind of evidence stopped being decisive. The mere fact of suspicion was already enough. This saved a lot of time and made their work much easier. Why bother figuring out whether a person was guilty or not? All the Oprichnik needed to know was whether the victim was on the list or not. As you can guess, the lists were made without input from those included. The system's appeal lay in its universality. The Oprichnik could serve as investigator, judge, prosecutor, and executioner, sometimes all in one day. This allowed them to act quickly and efficiently, but it had a side effect, because people who received such power began to use it not only for its intended purpose. The protection of the state gradually turned into a way to solve personal issues, improve one's financial situation, and get rid of inconvenient neighbors. Here is where the Oprichnina began to consume itself. The longer such a system existed, the more people appeared in it for whom serving the sovereign became a cover for ordinary robbery. What did an Oprichnik look like? An Oprichnik's appearance was more than clothing. It was a language the authorities used to communicate silently. A man in black had to be recognizable immediately, even before he opened his mouth or presented an order. The main image was built around simple and deliberately rough black clothing, reminiscent of monastic robes. It stressed showy asceticism and separation from society. The Oprichnik appeared to have given up ordinary life and followed different rules. At the same time, beneath this outward simplicity, there was often expensive weaponry and luxurious clothing hidden, which was inaccessible to most of the kingdom's inhabitants. The famous symbolism with brooms and dog heads deserves special attention. Sources do not agree on how often these items were used in a literal sense. It was probably not a regular practice, but rather symbolic gestures, yet the powerful image endured for centuries. The broom stood for sweeping away betrayal, while the dog showed readiness to attack the ruler's enemies. Even if in reality it was more of a sign and a metaphor, they still produced a very real effect. Oprichniks carried typical 16th century weapons, sabers, spears, bows, and later firearms, like other servicemen. However, the carrier's status was more important than the weapon itself. And the Oprichnik did not come as a warrior to the battlefield, but as a representative of an authority to which there was no one to complain and from which you could not buy your way out. This outward image worked proactively. Often, the mere appearance of the Tsar's men was not enough to break the resistance, and they were feared because behind them stood a system in which there was no appeal. The black clothing warned that from now on the Tsar's will, not the law, prevailed. Where and how did the Oprichniks live? Getting into the Oprichnina wasn't enough. Staying in it mattered too. And for this, Ivan Grozny created a special environment around his sovereign's men, where service became not just a job, but a way of life. The Oprichnina was conceived as a closed circle of the chosen, bound together not only by fear, but also by ritual. Each of the sovereign's men swore a personal oath to the Tsar, placing loyalty to him above all. Any other loyalty, whether to family, kin, or former patrons, was seen as potential treason. The Oprichnina court was structured like a monastic brotherhood. They lived in areas previously occupied by others in Moscow, with entire streets and, across the country, estates, settlements, and manors assigned to them. An Oprichnik's daily life combined showy austerity with material comfort. There was talk of abstinence, prayers, and service, but also good food, warm houses, and incomes most could only dream of. These people lived better than the average serviceman, but worse than the boyar elite. Perhaps this was part of the plan, to give enough privileges so that they would be grateful, but not so many that they would feel independent. A typical day began early, and usually with prayer. Joint services were a mandatory part of life at the Oprichnina court. Ivan Grozny liked to highlight his religiosity, and expected the same from others. Missing a service could raise questions, and unnecessary questions in the Oprichnina were dangerous, because no one wanted to find out which was worse, God's judgment or when Ivan Vasilievich was in a bad mood. Faith here served not only spiritual purposes but also discipline. It united people into a single group and reminded them that their service supposedly had a higher meaning. In other words, the Oprichnina became both the rulers and the holy cause. Then the work started. Some did household chores, others handled administrative tasks, and some faced punitive actions. Some managed the stables and warehouses, some accompanied the Tsar, and others received name lists to carry out orders. Confiscation of property, arrests, or executions. It didn't matter what the orders were, it was not customary to discuss them. That was exactly why an Oprichnik was valued. In the evening, life could shift dramatically. After work, there were often feasts, loud, wild, and full of showy cheer. There was a unique vibe here, dark humor, disregard for pain, and bold bravado. Death in this world was so close that people tried to treat it as something ordinary. So, life for an Oprichnik passed between prayer and violence. Every day was a reminder that the position gained so quickly could disappear just as fast. And it was in this tense daily life that the Oprichniks gradually turned into those whom history remembers them as people for whom cruelty became part of their profession. Novgorod and the limits of madness. The Oprichnina could still claim to be acting selectively for a while. Yes, brutally and without trial, but still following the logic of seeking traitors at court and among the elite. And Novgorod broke this logic because here the enemy turned out to be not just an individual or even a family, but an entire city. A wealthy, historic and economically vital city in the kingdom. The official reason was typical: suspected treason among Novgorod boyars, and clergy suspected of wanting to join Lithuania. Whether this matched reality is a separate issue. No one cared about evidence anymore. The decision was made in advance and the rest was just a formality. The march of the Oprichniks on Novgorod looked like a punitive expedition against their own rear in the midst of a difficult war. Even by the standards of the 16th century, this was, to put it mildly, strange. What happened next is hard to call a consequence in the usual sense of the word. The city became the accused with no chance to defend itself. Executions, confiscations, torture, and public punishments continued for weeks. At the same time, not only the supposed conspirators were destroyed, but also everything that could be considered questionable elements. Basically, almost anyone in the way. Historians dispute the numbers. The lowest estimates speak of several thousand dead, while broader ones mention 7, 10, or even more victims. But in a city with a population of about 30,000 people, even the most cautious estimates mean a catastrophe. The catastrophe of Novgorod was not so much in the number of those killed, but in the consequences. After the Oprichniki left, the city was economically devastated, trade and ties collapsed, and hunger and disease began. Even those spared execution often couldn't resume their old lives, leading to the city's gradual decline in the 16th century. That is why Novgorod became a turning point. If previously the Oprichnina could justify itself by punishing the guilty, it soon became clear the system was destroying not conspiracies, but its own economic and social foundation. During a tough war, the Tsar himself destroyed a key region behind the front lines. From that moment, the Oprichnina stopped being an instrument of fear and became a source of strategic weakness. It no longer strengthened the state, but directly undermined it from within. Both the victims and the Tsar's own people noticed this, because if an entire city can be crushed, then no single person in this system is protected by definition. Were the Oprichniks soldiers? After Novgorod, the Oprichniks had just one last chance to show that their actions had any practical meaning. If they couldn't save the country from within, they could at least prove themselves in war. This is where the myth of the Oprichnina's power quickly collapsed. Oprichniks were seen as military men, armed with horses, service experience, and their own army. But, as I already mentioned, they were selected based on their personal loyalty to the Tsar, and military skill didn't matter. While this worked perfectly well inside the country, since fear compensated for professionalism, it didn't work in a real war. The Oprichniks were only effective against those who couldn't resist, but when it came to real combat, things were completely different. The most telling moment came in 1571 when the Crimean Khan Devlet Girey marched on Moscow. The threat was real, and their combat readiness needed testing against a well-organized steppe army, not armed townspeople. The Oprichnina and Zemshchina troops formally set out together, but acted separately, without unified command and with poor coordination. The result was painful. Tatar detachments bypassed Moscow's forces, entered the city, and set it on fire. Almost the entire capital, including the Oprichnina court, burned. The Oprichniks, once accustomed to attacking at night, were surprised when people confronted them by day with sabers and fire, leaving them defenseless. After the Moscow fire, their ineffectiveness became clear. Not because the warriors didn't know how to handle weapons, but because the whole system was built not for war, but for terror, and when this terror faced real war, real fighting in Moscow, it simply didn't work. How and why did the Oprichnina end? Ivan the Terrible's failure to defend Moscow was a rare moment when he couldn't blame reality on treason or conspiracy. He then started searching for those responsible within his own system. As a result, the Tsar's people were impacted. Arrests, executions, and confiscations started. Those who had fought treason yesterday were suddenly suspects themselves. It's an instructive moment for a system built on the idea that when something goes wrong, someone has betrayed. The Oprichnina was never formally abolished or declared a mistake. Ivan Gross started winding it down, returning some Oprichnina lands to general administration, merging the troops, and the term slowly vanished from official documents. Moreover, the word Oprichnina was soon completely forbidden to use, as if the Tsar wanted not so much to close or destroy it, but to erase even the memory of it. The Oprichniki themselves did not disappear after that moment. Some perished during the internal purges, some returned to regular service and blended in with the mass of servicemen, and some managed to retain their position and influence, pretending the Oprichnina was never part of his biography. The irony of the ending was that the most famous Oprichnik, Malyuta Skuratov, died in a real war during the storming of a fortress. The man who became the embodiment of internal terror died where he was finally required to be a soldier, not an executioner. And so, the Tsar's men of Ivan the Terrible lived their short but very turbulent existence. The story of the Oprichniks often ends with their official dissolution, as if with the disappearance of the name, the problem itself disappeared too. But in reality, the Oprichnina was a very vivid experiment on the country and its people. And its consequences turned out to be much more lasting than the 7 years of its official existence. After Ivan Grozny, the state returned to the same methods more than once, only under different names and with different ideologies. The eras changed, but the logic remained recognizable. If it's hard to govern, it's easier to intimidate, and if something goes wrong, it means enemies are lurking somewhere again. That's all from me. This was the History Show. If you found it interesting, please support the video with a like and a subscription, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye, everyone.